Good evening. My name is Noliwe Rooks. I'm the Du Bois Professor in Africana Studies and the Director of American Studies here at Cornell University. I want to apologize for our starting a few minutes late and to dive right in to my welcome and introduction of our moderator. Tonight's program, our third in a series of 5 of Racism in America webinars, is sponsored by the American Studies Program in partnership with the College of Arts and Sciences, the Law School, Alumni Affairs and Development, Diversity Alumni Programs, and eCornell, who we thank for all of their technical support. I also just want to make sure you know that you can submit questions for the panel via the URL in the event overview just below the video player. To introduce our moderator for the evening, Kat Stafford is a national investigative writer focused on race and inequity at the Associated Press. She investigates how structural racism has fueled inequity in America through the lens of politics, government, health, environmental justice, and more. She was elected to a 2-year term in 2020 as a board of director for the Investigative Reporters and Editors, the industry's leading nonprofit organization focused on investigative journalism. She's also the chair of that body's Member Services Committee. An award-winning journalist and Detroit native, Stafford was previously an investigative journalist at the Detroit Free Press and has received several awards for her work. She was part of a 2-person reporting team that won Michigan's Associated Press Media Editors 2019 First Amendment Award for the Free Press's Make Your Date investigative project. On behalf of American Studies and Cornell University and the College of Arts and Sciences, Kat, welcome.
Thank you so much for that just amazing introduction. And I am so honored to be here tonight to lead this discussion. When Cornell first approached me about moderating this topic, I thought, what more relevant thing could we be discussing in this moment right now? We're coming off of a year where we saw the convergence of really 3 national crises, right? We saw the pandemic, we saw the economic fallout of the pandemic, but we also saw a global movement for racial justice emerge after the killing of George Floyd. So tonight I am honored again to help lead this conversation. So we have a great stellar panel tonight, and each panelist will be giving a 3-minute introduction and brief presentation. First up will be Ella Diaz, who is the Associate Professor of Latina and Latino Studies in English.
Hi, thank you so much. What I wanted to bring to the conversation tonight is a quick glimpse of the history of representation that disrupts commonplace and current assumptions about people based on their races and other markers of identity in our society. I also wanted to talk about the power of symbols and signs, what we call semiotics, to situate protest art from the 60s and 70s, because when it's shown and studied, it surprises viewers with its applicability to contemporary political and human crises. But these images are only known when they're taught, and not only in universities and specialized courses like my own, but in public schools and at elementary and high school levels. This is American Art History 101. Perhaps, though, they're not taught for a reason, because in the absence of art like this, what also is erased is the interdependency of strengths, acknowledged and equal, that can help generate new ways of being in the world. And Rupert Garcia created Libertad para los Prisioneros Políticos, a poster based on a photograph of Angela Davis, and commented that being a Chicano and developing an understanding of the common struggle of oppressed peoples, I supported her, and I used Spanish to express international solidarity between Black and Raza peoples. So Garcia related to Davis not as a Black woman, but through his embodied experiences as a Chicano and a shared struggle against state oppressions and resistances to such oppression. And this art and the history it tells beyond the level of the surface of the symbols is important because it tells stories about who we are as a people, coming together to share ideas and solve our shared problems. Yolanda Lopez, for example, meets Emory Douglas on a visit to the Black Panther Party office to learn layout techniques for making a newspaper. Lopez's techniques and her collage style, as well as the symbols that she uses in Basta Ya, was directly influenced by Douglass and his design choices for the Black Panther newspaper. 2 decades before Douglass and Lopez, however, exchanged their ideas, African-American painter Charles White, along with sculptor and artist Elizabeth Catlett, journeyed to Mexico in the 40s to work with the Taller de Gráfica Popular and learn popular graphics and arts productions. Charles White goes on to create epic murals of Black people, and he teaches at the Otis College of Art and Design, where he then instructs Chicana artist Judith Hernandez, a central image maker of the Chicano movement and Chicana art more broadly. So my point here is to underscore the layers of collaboration between artists in the 1930s and 40s that anticipates the 60s and 70s coalitions and alliances that are really the foundation of the alliance, what we call solidarity and allyships of today. Artists of color never were or are simply contained by the nation, but intellectually, politically, and creatively move across national boundaries, fusing artistic ideas and making work that doesn't center on exceptionalist notions of nation or empire, but sparks consciousness raising through art that centers on creative potentials of difference and interdependency, of needing one another instead of hierarchy. And this possibility is still available to us in the 21st century. And I'm largely quoting 2 historical critical race theorists, Audre Lorde and Angela Davis, that woman from Rupert Garcia's poster. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella, for that. And next up, we will have Russell Rickford, who is the Associate Professor of History.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks, Kat, and thanks, Ella. It's great to be here with good friends and comrades. In 1972, the West African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral urged African Americans to address the underlying causes, not merely the symptoms, of racial oppression. If a bandit comes to my house and I have a gun, he told Black activists in New York, I cannot shoot the shadow of the bandit, I have to shoot the bandit. Many people lose energy and effort and make sacrifices combating shadows. We have to combat the material reality that produces the shadows, he said. Today, anti-racist organizers face a similar test. They must combat the material realities of oppression while avoiding preoccupation with its secondary manifestations. So it's important to distinguish between liberal frameworks for anti-racism and progressive or radical frameworks for anti-racism, right? So we're going to distinguish between liberal frameworks and progressive or radical frameworks. Let's start with liberal frameworks, which are far more pervasive. So liberal challenges to racism are not just superficial. They're designed to legitimate rather than challenge the status quo, to distract from and conceal structural racism. Racial liberalism reinforces the myth of American exceptionalism, the idea that the US is a uniquely egalitarian social experiment destined to fill principles of liberty and democracy. Racial liberalism stresses individual and behavioral strategies, right? Kindness, tolerance, etc. Racial liberalism relies on interpersonal diplomacy and rituals of racial enlightenment, reconciliation, and virtue. So MLK Day celebrations, corporate Black History Month events, and other gestures of symbolic reform. And racial liberalism loves forums. Its preoccupation with dialogue reflects the false premise that racism stems from a lack of individual understanding or education, rather than from the desire to dominate, to exercise systemic power. In fact, tonight's event, in many ways, is part of the moral theater of liberalism. Now, conversations like this one may be helpful in some ways, but they are also attempts to reassert legitimacy. Cornell as an institution functions largely to reproduce the capitalist class structure, but it needs to project a social mission aura. Sponsoring racial justice forums help reassert the legitimacy not only of an institution like Cornell, but of an entire liberal regime of social management, a regime that promotes multiculturalism, even as it pursues white supremacy, capitalism, and imperialism. The liberal performance of racial virtue includes indigenous land acknowledgements without land justice or land redistribution, Black Lives Matter lawn signs and street murals without dismantling mass imprisonment and defunding police. On a national level, the performance includes the recent presidential inauguration ceremony, an interracial pageant designed to conceal the continuation of US imperialist and white supremacist policies in Afghanistan, Venezuela, Palestine, the African continent, Puerto Rico, and right here at home. Racial liberalism always chooses symbolic change over structural change. Its purpose, again, is to preserve the existing system, to stymie fundamental transformation. And in recent decades, racial liberalism has developed the cunning language of diversity. Liberal rituals of diversity help maintain the status quo by creating a bureaucracy, right? A management regime designed to absorb and pacify demands for racial justice and replace them with the theme of heterogeneity and inclusion. What is the alternative to racial liberalism for people of conscience who are genuinely committed to justice, right? How do we transcend symbolism and the choreography of the diversity industry? Well, before liberals co-opted the idea, anti-racism was a term associated with the left. Originally, anti-racism suggested a radical alternative to both the liberal rhetoric of multiculturalism and to claims that the US had substantially defeated racism and was therefore post-racial, and that all that was needed was official policies of colorblindness. Anti-racism was a term associated with decolonial and anti-imperialist approaches. Anti-racists recognized that white supremacy was as American as apple pie, that the entrenchment of racial hierarchy was an integral part of settler colonialism, a historical process that connects the US to South Africa, Israel, and other colonialist regimes. Anti-racists saw racism not as a detour from an egalitarian American creed, but as a natural byproduct of capitalism and imperialism. They believed the US rested on the same structures of white supremacy and capitalist exploitation that upheld other empires. They recognized the construction of racial systems as an essential aspect of the expropriation of land, the division and exploitation of labor, the accumulation of capital, and the control of foreign and domestic resources and markets upon which modern capitalism depends. Whereas racial liberals stressed individual behavior and conscience, a hearts and minds approach, radical anti-racists emphasized political economy and the operation of systems of power. Whereas racial liberals sought solutions in formal equality before the law, radical anti-racists called for a far more thoroughgoing transformation of society to ensure human rights and equality in housing and income, in healthcare, in lending, in trade unions, in education, in ecological conditions, in land tenure, etc. Radical anti-racists had a materialist critique of racial capitalism. They knew justice required not just interpersonal reconciliation, reflection, or dialogue, not even just the dismantling of overtly racist structures, but genuine reallocations of resources and power, attacking the roots of white supremacy, meant challenging the normal operations of capitalism and imperialism at home and abroad. I think at its best, the Black Lives Matter movement reflects this more substantive and redistributive mode of anti-racism. What we need is not more civil dialogue, but more insurgent, popular anti-racist movements that fight the whole apparatus of oppression, demand an end to mass incarceration, immigrant detention, war, and racist foreign policies. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Russell. And before I go to our next panelist, just want to remind our audience that you can submit questions for the panel via the URL in the event overview just below the video player. So please submit your questions for us. So the next panelist that we have tonight is Christine Vallancey, who is the director of the Asian American Studies program, and she's also the Associate Professor of Performing and Media Arts. Christine?
Thank you, Kat, and to my esteemed co-panelist. Thank you to Noliwe, Linda, and everyone behind the scenes who make tonight's event possible. I am especially grateful for this opportunity because more often than not, Asian Americans are left out of conversations on race, let alone ones on protest and disobedience. So this erasure has had detrimental cost. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a 1,900% rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. These attacks have not only come from civilians, but also from law enforcement, particularly in cases of mental health crises. Vicha Ratanapakdi, Angelo Quinto, Christian Hall are just a few of the names of those we have already lost in just this 3 months of 2021 alone. In America, we're witnessing a resurgence of anti-Asian violence, part of a longer history from the attacks on South Asians and Muslims in the wake of 9/11 to the death of Vincent Chin in '82, from the detainment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps to the riots that greeted Asian workers' arrival since the mid-1800s. Anti-Asian violence has not only been enacted on U.S. soil, it includes a century of U.S. wars and imperial occupations in the Philippines, Hawaii, Japan, Korea, across the Pacific Islands, Vietnam, and of course our secret wars in Laos and Cambodia. Yet for every one of these violent acts, there has been equal resistance and protest from who we call ourselves Asian Pacific Islander Desi Americans. And perhaps this is the most insidious violence of all, the ways in which the pervasive model minority myth has framed us in the eyes of our fellow Americans. By returning to and reckoning with these histories of APITA social protest, we find one possibility for moving forward. So if we think about the history of the term Asian American, coined by actual student organizers in '68, it was first understood as a socio-political term of self-definition, self-determination, and empowerment. As musician Chris Ijima noted, Asian American was less a marker of what one was and more a marker of what one believed. The son of internment survivors and New York City organizers, Ijima chose the guitar over the bullhorn, with songs cutting through noisy rallies. The Asian American movement organized along the lines of a Third World Liberation Front. Utopic, albeit imperfect, Third World helped us imagine our lives and histories as entangled with others. We were the majority, not minority, but also lived under violent systems of war, land occupation, and slavery. Since the late 1960s, Asian Americans have taken to the streets to fight for Black power, Native American sovereignty, Puerto Rican independence, the farm workers movement, and so forth. And since that time, our documentary artists, such as the late Corky Lee, filmmakers Curtis Chin, Renee Tajima Pena, have worked to capture our spirit and struggles. And theirs is a record of the past 50 years of APITA disobedience, civil or otherwise. So as I close here today, I just want to argue, as I did in my first book, for disobedient listening as a method and practice. With its meaning from the Latin dis, against, and obedire, to listen or hearken, our disobedience starts by listening against white supremacy and its ideas. To listen against the limited mainstream media narratives of our communities, the ones that further pit us against each other, leading us to believe that one group's success or struggle is another group's detriment. To listen against educational systems that disconnect us from our disobedient APITA histories and leaders, Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, Larry Itliong, and Philip Veracruz, the multiracial coalition fighting for senior housing at the International Hotel. And if you don't know these names or their stories, then you know yourself why, and then take the initiative to research, learn, and grow. And for my fellow APITA Americans out there, let's listen against ideologies that lull us into thinking that our adjacency to whiteness will somehow save us, that want us to ignore our anger and our rage and our grief, that try to convince us that we are not part of a network of natural intelligence cultivated by BIPOC people. In a recent New York Times op-ed, Professor Ann Chang argued that Asian Americans are tired of insisting that others care. The truth is that few are listening. But tonight, I know that there are at least hundreds of you out there listening. And so from this day forward, let us promise to listen against so that we can begin to reimagine a world together, a world that does not center whiteness or white supremacist thinking, but instead our entangled lives and our collective liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for those powerful remarks. Our next panelist is Margaret Washington, who is the Marie Underhill Knoll Professor of American History.
Thank you, and hello, my colleagues and moderators. It's very good to be here. The Declaration of Independence's wording has always provided a loophole and an opportunity to challenge the white supremacy of this nation's core founding. The Declaration became the caveat to a constitution protecting Black slavery and making white homogeneity the law of the land. For despite the Constitution's flexibility for future generations, it encoded prejudice, difference, otherness, and police power over an entire race of people. It created a white supremacy mindset within the national fabric that still holds us hostage. So in seeking the roots of white supremacy, look no further than the Constitution. Oppressed Americans have historically challenged unjust laws of the land. A young enslaved New Yorker who became Sojourner Truth took her freedom in 1826, as did 20-year-old Marylander Frederick Douglass. Rebels of color have always had white allies. In 1848, Henry David Thoreau's concept of civil disobedience proved to be a mantra for others, including Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. Thoreau excoriated American slavery and American imperialism against Mexico. He urged resistance, rebellion, and non-allegiance to a government engaged in organized oppression and overrunning other nations. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison publicly burned the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Historically, anti-racist initiatives and coalitions have led to change. The three progressive Civil War amendments, while needing tweaking from time to time, like the Tree of Liberty, ensured equal protection and full citizenship despite white supremacy backlashes. Confrontations bring fits and starts, gains and losses. In 1909, white terrorism inspired Black women and men, the grandchildren of abolitionists and Jewish Americans, to establish the NAACP, the first national biracial civil rights organization since slavery. It not only frontally challenged white supremacy in court, but ushered in the civil disobedience leading to the civil rights movement. And yet oppression increases as our nation expands, forcing struggle mantra to assume proportions previously unthought of, and greater vigilance is needed. The late historian George M. Frederickson wrote about the evolutions of white nationalism in America, from scientific racism to white supremacy to white homogeneity, and he documents this phenomenon for various times, regions, among particular individuals and groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center, founded 50 years ago to track hate groups, has hair-raising statistics about the rise of white nationalism. We saw it in action on January 6th. The nation has struggled with white supremacy since its inception. But for the first time in our history, in my opinion, we have a white nationalist president, or had. The Southern Poverty Law Center documents white supremacy permeating American life, its pervasiveness in law enforcement, the courts, education, and other institutions. Single bias hate crime murders rose nearly 50% in the last 10 years, mostly against Blacks and Hispanics, but also against Jews, LGBTQs, the disabled, and Asian Americans. The white bias of nationalism is a great danger, and the Southern Poverty Law Center says white nationalism surpasses white supremacy. The SPLC calls white nationalism weaponized white supremacy. Its clear intent is eradication of non-whites, not mere oppression, eradication. Consider the prison pipeline, policing, immigration policy. Consider turning cages into residences for non-white immigrant children. Consider forcibly removing non-white immigrant children from their parents and parceling them out to places unknown with no recorded accountability. Consider Charlottesville. Consider January 6th. And then consider our crying need to consider more and more civil disobedience if we are to fundamentally change this nation. And I would like to add in closing that the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was founded in 1971 by an attorney named Morris Dees in Montgomery, Alabama, and civil rights activist and later Congressman Julian Bond, now for the first time has an Asian executive director, the former director of the Amnesty International. So there is much to do. And I'm looking forward to the discussion for the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And now for our final speaker on the panel, Aziz Rana, who is the Richard and Lois Cole Professor of Law.
So first, I'd like to thank Kat for that introduction, and really all the organizers. It's just a pleasure to be here with all of you and to have the opportunity to engage with all of your really rich reflections. So as somebody that studies constitutional law, in many ways, my comments are really an extension of what we've just heard from Margaret. And what I'd like to focus on are really the impediments to movements for racial justice and liberation. You know, movements like the ones that Russell was really highlighting, due specifically to our legal political system. So these movements already face a basic challenge that you've heard about, which is the fact that the US has been organized around a basic divide between racially privileged insiders and various non-white peoples whose land and labor provide the essential basis for elite wealth and power. And this means that the push for freedom for subordinated communities has to grapple with a minority-majority dynamic that Christine sort of noted, which is that African-American persons, as well as indigenous peoples and BIPOC communities more generally, can really be thought of as part of an anti-colonial global majority. But within the context of the United States, Black people, for example, constitute a relatively small population within the broader framework of a majority white society. And so how is it that you can generate change from within those circumstances? So that's a kind of defining predicament that faces liberation politics and the shaped movement struggle. But there's also a specific dynamic in the US that exacerbates this challenge. And that's the fact that the constitutional system essentially gives additional legal political power to white opponents of racial equality. And you can see this power is operating in two ways. So the first is that the constitutional system from the founding is just riddled with anti-democratic elements. So we can think of the Electoral College, the Senate, and the disproportionate power that it gives to rural and various other white population centers, gerrymandering in the House of Representatives, federalism and quote-unquote states' rights, the construction of the Supreme Court, the nomination and confirmation process of the Supreme Court through the presidency and the Senate. All of these, and these are issues that have really become, part of the conversation at present, all of these really mean that throughout American history, from the early 19th century to today, you effectively need rolling supermajorities, electoral supermajorities, to implement institutional legislative change. And that for most of that history, these rolling supermajorities have to be white supermajorities. And so as a result, white opponents can use veto points to stymie change. And then even if you actually have meaningful change, like in the form, for example, of 1965's Voting Rights Act, over time, the kind of fractured nature of the political system and the systematic reality of these veto points allow white opponents to then undermine the meaningfulness of that change. Now, the second way in which this power operates really is through the kind of constitutional, or we can think here really of institutional incentives that feed authoritarian tendencies within conservative white politics. Whether we're talking about the late 19th century or today in the wake of the Capitol mob attack, specific party elites understand their own power as dependent on disenfranchisement and minority rule. And what this does is it reinforces a vicious and white supremacist cycle that is seemingly encoded into the very DNA of American politics. So we have a reality in the present, but we could be talking about the 1950s, or we could be talking about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, where we have mob attacks and racist violence that are both lawless, but critically here, facilitated as well by the minoritarian elements of the constitutional system. And all of this, I think, is a key reason why much of Black political mobilizing in the US, especially over the last century, has often taken two different forms, and this is more or less where I'm going to end. The first is mobilization that is often itself spontaneous. and a direct reaction to the everyday and ubiquitous state violence that these authoritarian tendencies in the institutional order promote and then provide cover for, so that this violence not only is promoted, but operates in a context of general and extreme impunity. And so mobilization occurs as a response to the ways in which such violence is actually perpetuated in part through the nature of our existing legal political system. And then the second is the fact that such mobilization is often framed in the language of mass democracy as an effort not just to liberate, let's say, the African-American experience, but to combine what somebody like James Boggs called the need for Black liberation with something like an American political revolution, where you have insurgent mobilization on behalf of genuine democratic commitments in a society that, while engaging in the language of democratic legitimacy, doesn't actually provide meaningful self-rule to the vast majority of people within the country. And as part of this democratic agenda, of which there are many different components that we can get into, one slice has always been the seemingly simple idea that in the United States, one person, one vote should actually govern, rather than a system that seems to facilitate minority rule.
And Aziz, thank you so much. All of you, thank you for those wonderful introductions. And so I just want to remind everyone that we're here tonight to continue this ongoing series, Racism in America. And tonight we're going to dive a bit more into how protest movements and civil disobedience have sought to both end and uphold white supremacy and racial discrimination. But first, I just want to ask a very basic question. This might seem silly to all of you because you've spent so much time understanding the history of protest movements, but for some of the folks in our audience who might kind of just be learning about this for the first time, how do you define a protest movement? What makes a protest movement? And how do you also define civil disobedience? Just through the course of my reporting, you know, I've run into a lot of different people who have very different meanings. So I would love to hear from each of you or some of you. How do you define it? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I could venture maybe a helpful paradigm, which comes in part from popularized perhaps by the great freedom fighter Ella Baker, who helped to mentor the young people of the radical desegregation movement, particularly within the context of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Ms. Baker, as the young activist called her, like to talk about getting to the root of social problems. And so their concept of radicalism was exactly that, a struggle to address the underlying source, the root causes of inequality. So for me, a radical movement in particular is a movement that is not invested necessarily in preserving or in tweaking political or economic institutions or cultural structures or realities, but that is really seeking to get to the root causes of inequality and injustice and oppression. So I think that as we try to construct and reconstruct and expand some of the ongoing movements that my comrades have talked about already, those of us who are interested in fundamental transformation, I think that's a useful, litmus test, if you will. How do we get to the bottom of these really systemic problems? Or as Amilcar Cabral would say, how do we shoot the bandit rather than just attacking the shadow?
And I kind of want to pivot to something that Russell kind of just sparked in my mind. Margaret, I was hoping that you could kind of go back and touch on the movement. You talked a lot about the earlier movements. You talked about civil rights. Can you kind of touch on what sort of resistance did those early movements face in regard to the broader idea of white supremacy and white nationalism?
Are you referring to the movements in the mid-century, mid-20th century, or earlier?
Well, let's start with talking about the civil rights movement.
And so they basically faced civil disobedience. They were disobeying laws about protests. And of course, they were in the South. And even though we have our First Amendment's rights, they didn't have those rights in the South because, of course, Southerners knew what they were complaining about. They were complaining about segregation laws. So to go to a court and ask for an edict to have a march, if it's refused and you march anyway, that's a manifestation of civil disobedience, which they did frequently, for which they were beaten. And well, one example, of course, is what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, in the Selma March. And they were told to go back, and they were going, in fact, going to obey the law, but they didn't move fast enough. So in some cases, they would obey the law. In other cases, they would not. They would simply kneel and pray and not obey the law. So, but they're all kinds of stages of civil disobedience. What Thoreau was recommending was far more radical, for which he went to jail. And his attitude was jail is where everybody belonged if they were going to disobey unjust laws, because you should not obey them. There's a wonderful story where he is put in jail for not paying his taxes, and he wouldn't pay his taxes because they supported the Mexican War. And he was in jail, and I believe it was Emerson who went to see him, and he said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And he said, Ralph, what are you doing out there? And if you think about Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, there's a synchronicity, because King was responding to people who were basically, these were so-called liberals, most of them white, who in their minds supported the civil rights movement. And they felt that he was moving too fast. And King's response was almost classic Thoreau, because he took the same position that Thoreau did, and that is that, you don't obey unjust laws, and if the price is going to jail, then that's where you belong.
I'm so glad you mentioned Selma. I believe we're coming up pretty soon on the 56th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. I just had the privilege of talking to Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who just really gave me the history of what that was like, the planning that went behind that. So I want to move on to, we have our first audience question that came in. What do you think about using the idea of caste, which of course is the book that was written by Isabel Wilkerson, rather than strictly race as an organizing concept for explaining our current social problems? I would love one of our panelists who has not had the chance to speak yet to jump in on this.
So I guess, I'll jump in just by saying that I actually think in some ways the most productive overarching framing device is one that Russell's already referenced, which is, thinking of race relations in the US as part of a global history of empire and the particular model of imperial politics that operated in this country as something that's called settler colonialism, where the relevant, comparative examples are countries like South Africa or the French in Algeria or Australia, where what defines power in America, just like in a place like South Africa, was that you had settler populations that wrested economic and political control from indigenous peoples, and then over time used various non-European communities, especially in the American context, enslaved African persons, to engage in the necessary but hard forms of labor required for economic growth and development. And that this created, a very specific kind of constitutional order where you had lots of different populations that were essentially subject populations of an American state that didn't necessarily face the exact same form of power. So indigenous peoples might face removal and then containment on a quote-unquote reservation system. African persons were enslaved, and then after the end of slavery, systematically denied meaningful rights, but formally included as citizens. Chinese migrants faced like complete removal, as well as various kinds of Jim Crow structures, so that there's different communities that face different modes of authority, but with an overarching frame that you can think of as marked by something like settler colonialism. Now, I think the concept of caste is helpful because of the way in which it's attempting to make sense of the linkage between the experience of all of these different communities. But the thing that I would add to it is that we can't really understand how racial formation in the US works without locating it within the imperial context, recognizing the different relationships that distinct subject communities had to the American state, as well as the connections between the form of colonialism that emerged in the US and the brands that emerged elsewhere.
Absolutely. And I just want to make note that we were having some technical difficulties that made it hard for folks to post their questions, but we have a link that was posted in the chat that you can use to submit your questions that I will ask the panelists. We have another great question from the audience. Would our public education system be the best place to begin to address systemic change? And if not, with children, where to begin for optimal, significant impact? Ella or Christine?
Did you want to take it, Christine?
Go ahead, Ella.
Oh, yeah. Wow, that was sort of the central point that I was making. I appreciate all of the comments from the colleagues, but want to just to ground this back in, the power of symbols. Oftentimes we talk about, we need, and that's been a framing, speaking point the last couple of years, that we need structural change, not just symbolic gestures. And I always get a little apprehensive when I hear that, because the power of symbols really does determine what we know of ourselves and what we know of a people or a peoplehood. And I really do think that there is something to be said, that a lot of the images that I was showing this evening very quickly, for the people watching, many of you may not have seen these before, or have seen them in passing and maybe had a visceral reaction to them, but then question that reaction. Where is that reading of this image coming from? Is it your own, or has it been sort of imposed upon you in how it's represented in mainstream culture? So I think the important point that I was trying to make is that we exist within a history of ideas, and the ideas that are being exchanged in a lot of these collaborations and these dialogues, this dialogical teaching, sort of speaking back to powers by countering a regime of representation, particularly mainstream representations of people of color, which is 9 times out of 10, it's the majority way that we access experiences of other peoples. These artists were coming together and pushing back not only on representations of self, but as you saw with Garcia, representations of Black America, and sort of anticipating what we now call Afro-Latinidad, Afro-Latinx, and was trying to build that sort of intersectional, interdependent understanding that there have always been Black Latino people, right? And so what would it mean to teach these images along with the histories in which they are created in our secondary levels, in our elementary levels? And there's certainly widespread children's literature that encompasses this. So I just feel sometimes that we get a little off the mark if we're only thinking about structural change and not really the importance or the power of symbols to really do a lot of this work, so that we can sort of shift or pivot in how we approach this whole concept of of citizenship and Americanness, that we have these parallel histories of ideas all around us when it comes to symbolism. And we could take them up, and we could certainly teach those at the elementary and secondary level.
Can I just follow up on that really fast, Kat? Just sure. To say, and I appreciate my dear friend and comrade Ella's always giving me my art history lesson, which I need because I'm a stuffy historian. And the beautiful and inspiring images, I think that the key distinction here is the question of control, right? I mean, who is controlling the images and the imagery and the representation for what purpose, right? So, I mean, I think some of the beautiful images that Ella showed us reflects a real dialectic between insurgent image making and knowledge production and grassroots movements, right? You know, mass struggle. I think today, what you have is a kind of a racial management regime that attempts to control and construct the imagery and manipulate the politics of representation without addressing the material realities that the grassroots struggles, right, that accompany the images that Ella's highlighting were actually, you know, seeking, right? I think it's important to point out that the Black freedom struggle, for example, always had a vision of, you know, full political and social participation, as well as economic democracy and autonomy and human rights and full access to, you know, dignified employment, the protections of trade unionism, robust social spending and public services. So there's a kind of a new narrative of the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle that was constructed in the aftermath of the defeat, right, in many ways of these struggles, that attempt to control the narrative in order to reinforce, as we said earlier, this narrative of American exceptionalism, and at the same time erase, I mean, both the ongoing struggles for racial justice and, critically, the ways in which white supremacy has actually evolved. Right, since, let's say, the assassination of King in 1968, the growth, for example, of mass incarceration, right? So, you know, we're faced with a situation now, as I suggested earlier, where the system depends on, relies on, and in fact centers and celebrates the narrative of racial, you know, progress and the incorporation of African Americans in particular into the social and economic fabric in order, as a sort of alibi, as a sort of national alibi, and as a kind of a morality tale that actually obscures ongoing, complex, and intransigent realities of racial apartheid. So I'm all for, you know, sort of reviving and reinvigorating and creating new sort of insurgent imagery along with the radical grassroots movements that we need to bring about material justice.
Yes, and thanks for sharing that perspective. Christine, did you want to respond? I actually had a specific question for you.
Oh, okay. But I just wanted to briefly kind of chime in because a lot of what Ella had mentioned kind of sparked ideas. So first of all, thinking about the realm of education, right? And education, I'm thinking here, especially of colleagues in California, specifically working around ethnic studies curriculum, right? And I'm thinking about the kind of backlash we've seen in Arizona, right, in the past decades, again, a certain type of curriculum going through, right? So education in many ways, right, is itself its own kind of structural change. But I think as somebody like Ella who studies art and popular culture, right, there are many ways in which this education can take place. So I think again about, and this may connect to what Aziz is talking about, the kind of the history of the International Hotel in San Francisco, right? The fight for it was multi-organizational, multiracial. It was really organized around housing rights broadly, right? As Russell is mentioning, right, that these earlier movements were about. But it was very much tied into these older men, right, who came as in bachelor societies, as laborers, as part of the long aftermath of U.S. empire in the Philippines, right? And so I think about the kind of historical record, the documentary filmmaking, and the ways in which it educates us, right, and stands as a record of that history that otherwise would have been lost, right? So I kind of want to just also maybe throw out to the audience and for us to consider that, popular culture, right, have its place, right, in terms of these kind of counter histories, and thinking more specifically about not just documentary, but narrative film, right? So thinking about the project of Judas and the Black Messiah, right? And telling us the history, right? The untold, or often untold history of Fred Hampton, right? And to go back to your question of what you're talking about, of what was the kind of backlash, right? What were the kind of stakes that activists were facing? And I think we really see it dramatized in that film. And perhaps that goes a bit further than, folks reading a book, right? Which of course, as professors wish they would do, but may not necessarily be the possibility. And I guess just a final thing to throw out there is that, I think that is a space in which I'm also seeing, I don't want to say positive, but the potential or possibilities of social media, right? In particular, the ways in which activists have taken whether to Twitter or to Instagram, right, to mobilize in different ways. So.
Yes, I'm really glad you touched on social media. That's something that I'm hoping to kind of dig into a little bit more. But, I did want to ask one question. As a journalist, one of the things that I believe is absolutely paramount in the work that I do is to really include historical facts, context, nuance. So from your perspective, who wants to chime in on this, how important is it for us to know our history and really know about it in a way that could help us make sense of the current movements that are happening today?
I just real quick pop in on that. That's sort of the point at which, speaking pedagogically, when I teach courses entitled Art, Poetry, Power, or I teach decolonial poetics and aesthetics, and I bring in the Black arts movement, and I bring in the Neo-Rican movement, the Chicano movement, certainly Yellow Peril, and I show the photographs, and we talk about the trilingualism, the people of color aesthetics, certainly the decolonial turn in the Third World Liberation Front strikes that my colleague had mentioned earlier, that people were creating this solidarity, this interdependency together, that Rupert Garcia is reading Angela Davis. He's reading her text. And then I look at the 21st century, Dignidad Rebelde, looking back at Fanon, but also looking at Aimé Césaire, but also reading Jose Montoya and reading widely. And the point being is these young students who have inclinations or have movements towards activism and commitments to human rights struggles, it's important that they learn this history. It's important that they understand this commonly shared struggle and these points that really are sort of, in this moment, they seem like I'm offering you anecdotes, but they really can become ways of talking about how to see your way through in this moment. Well, how would you put a newspaper together? How would you create, a counter narrative amidst, the cultural industrial machine? It becomes very pragmatic. It also can be spiritual. It can be that spiritual turn that needs to take place. One of the central issues of the last 4 years that I've overheard when students are talking is, as a white student, how can I X? How can I be a part of this? And these stories that I was presenting earlier, they give examples of how you can come together and how you can create these other symbols about commonality and shared struggle, that history of interdependency.
Absolutely. And I think you
Can I jump in here on this as well?
Please.
Yeah, so I think what you were saying is really important, that one of the things that defined political life in the US from really the 70s until the last 5-6 years, 2014 with Ferguson, basically, and the rise of Black Lives Matter, has been a fundamental fracturing in the political memory of protest in the US. So Russell was talking about, you know, the ideology of racial liberalism and American exceptionalism. A lot of that is part of a kind of Cold War myth-making about not only the nature of the country, but what's actually produced meaningful change. And the story is that meaningful change has largely taken place because those with power had basically good instincts and over time, you know, fulfilled the basic principles of the country, which are, you know, freedom and equality for all, regardless of race or gender. And, you know, my basic view is that it's a destructive myth because it does real damage to the actual history, which has been one of sustained struggle from people at the bottom. And it also eliminates from the historical record not only the experiences of profound state repression that activists face, from Martin Luther King to, you know, Fred Hampton, but the strategies, the tactics, the liberation vision that shaped so much of politics in this country for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, from participants in, you know, the American Socialist Party to New Deal activists to those that are involved in Black internationalism, from Du Bois, you know, all the way to both Martin and Malcolm. And what happened really in the 70s, starting in the 70s, was an erasure of all of that rich history. And it left folks of my generation, so, you know, I came of age politically in the 90s, really bereft of the kind of intellectual and political resources that are necessary to actually confront the conditions that we face. And one of the things I think has been most rewarding about the last few years is the fact that you have young people that are involved in a variety of different movement activities that are very consciously attempting to restitch an historical fabric that was destroyed, to think through, well, you know, who should be the heroes of the past? How do we draw lessons from experiences that have real continuities and resonances today? The very fact that a movie like Judas and the Black Messiah exists now is a function of a current environment that is attempting to take seriously what it means to revisit our history in a way that is honest, but also gives us tools for confronting the present.
And we have a question here specifically for Margaret. So the question says, Professor Washington, you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. responding to liberal white audiences. How would Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X's ideological differences reframe the American public opinion?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. The question is, you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. responding to liberal white audiences. Mm-hmm. How would Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's ideological differences reframe the American public opinion?
Reframe?
Yes.
American.
I believe that this question probably means if they were alive today.
How would they, is the person asking how would they envision their opinions of what's happening today?
Yeah, let's just ask the question in that way. If they were alive, how would they frame the discourse that's happening right now around protest movements, civil disobedience, in your opinion?
I think that both of them would be, given the transition that Malcolm X went through toward the end of his life, and given the transition that Dr. King went through, where his focus was on socioeconomic issues, and I should say parenthetically that what's coming out now is the fact that Dr. King was always involved in labor struggles. But I think that his later focus on labor and imperialism, socioeconomic issues in the Black community, and Malcolm X's transition to an international perspective and working with other groups, I think that both of them would be very much in the thick of what's happening now, including the Black Lives Movement. I could see both of them as being in a leadership position. And the Black Lives Movement, to me, is connected to the movement in the past generation. It's in a way, it has escalated in a way that I think we couldn't have even imagined. Its breadth, its deepness, and I think that they would be very much a part of that. And I also want to say something about the media, because I do a lot of public history, and I think one of the things that's important is that, and Russell spoke to this, is that who controls this media? There's been a lot of criticism of Judas and the Black Messiah. As far as African Americans are concerned, that I haven't seen the film, but I have seen two documentaries on the Black Panthers, in which the informant was interviewed. So the film is represented by a lot of activists as being superficial and not dealing with the real issues, and almost taking advantage of the movement in a way that some artwork does. So I think that, we have to be careful about representation of struggle, especially when it becomes popular and commodified.
And so let's stick with the media aspect for a second. Christine, you kind of touched on this about social media. So I'm thinking about earlier protest movements where we, of course, did not have social media, right? So it was a very, in some ways, symbiotic relationship where, they had to rely on local media outlets to provide coverage of what was happening on the ground, to show, in many cases, the brutality of what was happening in certain places across the country. But today, with Twitter, with Facebook, now protesters and movement organizers, now they can go directly to the people with what's happening. So how has social media evolved and changed the protest movement landscape? And has it allowed them to reach the masses in a better way, or has it harmed the cause at all?
I mean, I think both and, Kat, right? In many ways, and we saw this, right? And again, international movements around Arab Spring, right? And the kind of in which Twitter allowed for, and other platforms allowed for a certain virality, right, of ideas, of kind of getting the message out, as you said, which in the past actually probably didn't happen, right, through, well, we know that it did happen through public television, particularly around the Vietnam War, right? But of course, the media then quickly picked up on, let's not show, right, images of what we're actually doing overseas, because that actually will rally the people into the streets, right? So I think that in some ways, the possibilities of social media is its spreadability and its virality. And of course, again, that's also part of its intrinsic violence, right? The ways in which George Floyd's life, right, in those final moments becomes both a rallying cry, and that's kind of all we really know, right? Or many people, right, might know of his life. But I also think about, I'm interested in the ways in which something like a medium like Instagram, right? And we talk about, I think so much of social protests and protest movements is happening out in the streets. But I think especially now we're talking about this generation, I think it's also a deep reflection on one's own relationship, right, to one's body, one's own relationship to kind of one's own mental health, right? And I think we're especially seeing this in the last year, the pandemic, and everybody sheltering in place, right? And so I think about, again, the spreadability and the ways in which the work of folks like Adrienne Marie Brown, right, Sonia Renee Taylor, Prentice Hemphill, right, are really getting across and making people understand that, another form of disobedience, right, to systems of capitalism, of racial capitalism, right, are to really center oneself, right, rather than always feeling like one has to go fight the struggles out there.
Yes. And this next question is actually from the audience, but I kind of want to put my own twist on it if you guys don't mind. So one of the things that I really saw emerge while covering the protests over the summer was just the difference in how they were treated. We saw a lot of people getting arrested. We saw a lot of excessive uses of force against a lot of protesters. So Aziz, this might be a good question for you. This person stated that they heard today that there are 60 state legislature proposals concerning quote unquote rioters, with proposals to hold participants in jail without bail, etc. is there a federal way to deal with this abuse? And I guess my question is, how would you describe what we saw in terms of the differences that we saw with the treatment of Black Lives Matter protesters versus some of the state capitol protests that we saw where, you know, these folks were allowed to protest without being touched or harmed in any way?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think I have anything particularly original.
Well, you know, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I heard a little bit of feedback. So I don't really feel like I have anything particularly original to say about this.
Go
but
ahead,
I think what it really speaks to is, you know, the long-standing fact in this country about who has sovereign power and who's understood as properly American and who is not. And the simple fact, like one of the ways that I would describe the way that race has operated in this country is that, you know, that there's been a presumption that the way that the majority society understood as white enjoys the benefits of political freedom, economic independence, and well-being is through the suppression and subordination of various kinds of outsider groups. So when we talk about law and order is supposed to only operate in one direction. Like it's law and order that's imposed on threatening outsider communities. But for those that are on the inside, you know, basically like impunity for any acts of violence or lawlessness, because it's the insiders that are the sovereign people, the people whose rights are actually supposed to be promoted by the government. And this has a really long effect, well past what we think of as the actual formal end of segregation and Jim Crow. And it shapes how Black protest in particular is understood, which is Black protest is understood as a threat to the existing order, as a kind of quote unquote fifth column that destabilizes the state and that requires extreme forms of suppression. And we can see this from the 60s to today. In the 1960s, if you think about, like, you know, the Black Panther Party was a really small, relatively speaking, political entity. I mean, it had an extensive popular presence, but it wasn't a threat in any meaningful sense to the American state. And yet the federal government and local police forces engaged in an extreme act of repression, killing members, imprisoning the vast majority of those that were participants, essentially criminalizing any kind of involvement. And that has its own tentacles and legacies in how lots of Black protest is conceived of today, including the efforts at the state level. There are lots of different efforts to basically criminalize dissent when it comes to questions of race, to figure out mechanisms for imprisoning protesters and throwing the book basically at various kinds of protesters. While at the same time, lawlessness that's understood as sustaining the existing racial order is generally not treated the same way. And frankly, we can even see this in the response to the Capitol mob attacks, where yes, it's the case that the federal government is going to be going after those folks that were, you know, essentially low-level participants. But the basic story to me is very similar to the story of mob attacks against multiracial Reconstruction governments in the late 19th century in the South, where those that were high-level elected officials that were organizers and perpetuators of an effort to subvert democratic government essentially enjoy no consequences for their own actions. From Trump and Josh Hawley to Cruz all the way down, where the lesson basically of the mob attacks is that if you enjoy a position of political authority and power, if you control the instruments of the state, then your violence and action, which is lawless, will not be read as lawless.
And so we have a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, and I think Margaret or Russell might have something great to add to this question. What is the role of religion in the perpetuation of systemic racism and white supremacy?
I think it's pretty intense. I think that white Christianity has, from slavery times, taken the position that African Americans were not really people of faith who were included in the faith, Christian faith, Protestantism, in any meaningful way. And I think that that became politicized. We know that it is politicized today. The Christian right is essentially, oops, I'm sorry. The Christian right is part of what I call the rise of white nationalism. And I think that it's something that we have to recognize. It's there, it's in, you can read about it. I have a book on my list for my students to present their oral presentations on, and it deals with the rise of the Christian right in the period after the Civil War. So it has a long history, and it's very unfortunate because African Americans traditionally and historically have been people of faith. But Christianity has become politicized, and there is a very strong, I mean, all you have to do is look at the fact that the Christian right supports Donald Trump to see that this is really not about faith. This is about white supremacy. And I think that one of the major perpetrators of that is the religious sector, the white religious sector. I mean, that's my take on it.
Can I just add briefly, Kat, that I'm not a good person to ask about religion. I'm a secular Marxist, but I think I do have a response to that question. But I would, you know, the religion I would emphasize is not so much particular faith systems, but it's a kind of a civic religion. And I think that in many ways, the narrative of the Black freedom struggle has become a kind of a civil religion for the United States. Again, a kind of a legitimating narrative. And part of how that works is in an erasure of the kind of repression that Aziz and my other colleagues and comrades were talking about, right? So you have a kind of a sanitization of the reality of tremendous and aggressive and violent and sustained resistance by the state, right? And by its agents to any kind of meaningful racial transformation. And that erasure has become codified as the sort of mainstream story, not only of the civil rights movement, or not only of the modern Black freedom struggle in the 20th century, but it's become codified as a story of social change and social progress and social inclusion in the United States, right, as has been suggested. And so what happens is you get this situation where, for example, you have young Black Lives Matter protesters who will wear a T-shirt that says, you know, this ain't your grandma's, this not your grandparents' social justice movement. In order to suggest that this is an aggressive and insurgent movement, that it's not a respectable movement, that it's not a tame movement, which of course is based on complete fiction, right? So that erasure of an insurgent movement that faced tremendous resistance from the beginning to the end, and this is critical, and that is unfinished, right? That continues to this day. I think that's done a tremendous disservice. It's done a tremendous disservice to our society in general, but particularly to young activists who are now groping anew for a sense of heritage and a sense of continuity, right? So Black freedom is always a contested demand. We live in a white supremacist society, and it will always be a white supremacist society. It will be a white supremacist society as long as the underlying institutions, the fundamental structures that determine the means of production that determine the distribution of wealth, right, that determine the social hierarchy, those are fundamentally committed to maintaining inequality, right? So until we have wholesale transformation, in order to give people the tools, the social tools, the cultural tools, right, as Sister Ella was talking about, to grapple with those realities, we have to revive an insurgent history of these multiple and intersecting and complex movements. They're not just respectable. They're not just bourgeois. It's not just about clergy in the South. It's not just nonviolent. It includes Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists and communists and socialists and radical feminists and believers in armed struggle and anti-colonialism and internationalism and et cetera. And they are always, always, always deeply and aggressively contested by the white supremacist capitalist state. That's what we mean when we talk about racial capitalism.
Can I just piggyback on that for a second? And I appreciate that last piece because I can't help but think of the Virgin de Guadalupe as the framing icon of the processions for the farm workers in 65, you know, and how in terms of the United Farm Workers, a group that was started by Filipino farm workers and then merges with the Mexican American and the Latino farm workers, how Huerta and Chavez are using the Virgin de Guadalupe not only as sort of a way of bringing people together as sort of a religious protection through the valley into Sacramento, but also as a way of shaming the growers and the various farmers and landowners who are going to the same parishes, the same churches with these people because they practice the same faith. So religion has always been a political tool. I can't help but think of the people's priests that are assassinated and murdered in Central America during the Central American Wars in trying to defend the lives, you know, of their parishioners. And then you see the murals, the murales and the posters go up in the 60s and 70s in the mission to the various fallen clergy. In the same tradition that we have the portrait posters of the murdered of Ruben Salazar. And then in the 21st century, 2007, we have Oscar Grant, My Life Matters by Dignidad Rebelde. And then we see Trayvon Martin, and you see these coalitions of brown, Black, yellow, Native, and white people coming together to sort of put image, portrait, you know, what does the hero look like? I can't help but think really quickly a little earlier when we were talking about the Black Panther Party and how they were so small, perhaps structurally, but symbolically transcendent, powerful. We are still dealing and grappling with not only the discourse and the literature of the Black Panther Party and the great thinkers that come out of that group, but with the visual vocabulary. And that was one of the points that I was trying to make by pairing together that Emory Douglas, the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther, then not only shares space with Yolanda Lopez, but also teaches a whole generation of how to produce and disseminate your own iconography and visual vocabularies.
Thank you so much, Ella. And gosh, I wish we had more time, but it's 8:23 and I have to allow each of you to get your closing remarks in. But first, just really quickly, Christine, I did want you to answer one question that I think is really important. Looking toward the future, toward the next generation, there were a couple questions asking, what can I do? How can I affect change in my own community? One in particular is asking, how would you recommend the younger generation make an impact, considering how they use social media with the context that symbolic revolution is not as impactful? Just really quickly, I wanted you to chime in on that, Christine.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, I guess very kind of concretely, it would just be a kind of a critical consumption, right, of what's on social media. I mean, as much as there's, very vapid things, right, in celebrity culture, I think there's also too, I think so much about, with this recent rise in anti-Asian violence, the ways in which the stories, right, that are not getting covered, right, on MSNBC or, any other kind of major news channels are getting kind of pushed through, right, through these social media channels. And I think that also too, so much of what we've also understood is the ways in which social media and the niche, right, allows for conversations around the local, right, And so when I think about kind of what's happening in the space of Oakland Chinatown, an article that Momo Chang had written that really kind of unpacks, right, again, the folks on the ground who've been doing that work, who've been organizing and dealing with these kinds of issues, really kind of shift, right, the narrative that we see around this. So I've, you know, as I kind of I tell students, I actually in my classes often have them create social media campaigns, right, and to try to understand the beast, right, that they're looking at and they're dealing with almost every day. And I will give a shout out to students who, one year in the Intro to Asian American Studies class, did a social media campaign around documenting the undocumented, right? Because so much of the discourse around undocumented individuals in the US was around the Latinx community, overlooking the Asian Americans. And I think it really became a way for them to not only understand and curate, right, the content they were making, but really make connections, right, individuals who are already on the ground doing the work, right? And so they were researching, they were in conversation with folks. And so again, using that cultural tool, right, where in the past it was maybe the murals and the posters, and now it's the posts to really try to, affect that change.
Thank you so much, Christine. And now I want to offer each of you the chance to give your final remarks. I wish we had time to really touch on the insurrection. And really, I really wanted to hear a little bit about the role of white Americans in these protest movements, even today. A lot of that is on the backs of people of color. So I don't know if there's a way for you guys to kind of work that into your final statements. But Aziz, let's start with you for your final 1 minute remark.
Yeah, actually, do you mind clarifying? So when you say the role of white Americans, do you mean in the protest movements that we saw this summer and and
just moving forward, you know, the push for transformative change. What role does everyone have to play in this?
So actually, I think that, you know, maybe I'll just end with something that's more hopeful than some of my previous comments. And that's to say that I actually think we're in a really interesting historical moment that in some ways is quite different than the context that, you know, Black liberation and Black Panther activists faced in the late 60s, early 1970s. So if we look back 50 years ago, the country was really beginning a sustained period of deep conservative and racial reaction that was highlighted by, you know, massive landslide presidential victories for Nixon in 72 and then Reagan by the time we get to 84. And you had an agenda that was a transformative agenda that was really, you know, a universal one that was meant to deal with the structural questions of racial injustice in the context of transforming the economy and altering the US's imperial relationship to the rest of the world. But there just wasn't an expansive popular base for it. I mean, I think this is part of like the predicament that the left and radical activists faced at that time. If we look at this moment, it's not necessarily the case that you have a majority base for these views, but I do think it's really significant the number of people from across different walks of life that came out over the summer and the extent to which this agenda, you know, in many ways, it's a similar agenda that the movement for Black Lives called to divest and invest, to demobilize the carceral state, to press for things like, you know, guaranteed income, guaranteed job, to pursue a Green New Deal, to contest the use of American security state at the border, within the country, and overseas. These are all ideas that have the wind at their back. And these are all kind of interrelated movements that have a remarkable extra institutional capacity, a capacity to bring people out, you know, to engage in protest. And in a sense, I think what that suggests is that this is a moment that requires translating that extra institutional power, that intellectual sort of strength behind these ideas into actual institutional power, concrete institutional control over the state and economy. And that's the struggle for the present. It's an incredibly hard task. It's always been the task, but it operates in a moment where there's far greater general support than really we've seen during my entire life.
And can we go to Ella next? Just please keep your comments brief, since I know we're right at 8:30, but please, Ella, give your final remarks.
Yeah, I'll be brief. The first thing I want to say is I have to do this. I said the Oscar Grant was killed in 2007. He's killed in 2009. It's important to make sure you get those details right. That's how sensitive it is to me as a Northern Californian that was coming of age in many ways during that time, and seeing the response of the communities of people. You know, the 21st Century Rainbow Coalition. One of the most extraordinary things that I've seen in the last couple of years is the breadth and the diversity and the scope of people taking to the streets to protect one another and to stand in solidarity against state violence. I think that that's the hope of the future, is understanding our interdependency and the history of our interdependency.
Thank you, Ella, for that. And Russell, your final brief closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've enjoyed the conversation. You know, despite the remarkable signs of racial progress since the 60s, there was no fundamental redistribution of wealth and power to the African-American masses. America reneged on the promise of economic democracy as a basis for racial justice. At the same time, the U.S. narrative of triumph over racism became a defining feature of our society. Yet, African-Americans have faced even more complex racial barriers. This new regime of white supremacy has meant mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disfranchisement. Despite the growth of the Black middle class, the median net worth of white people remains 10 to 12 times that of African Americans. Black unemployment rate remains in double digits, twice that of white folks. 1 million Black people languish in jail or prison. So the proliferation of Black Lives Matter street murals and lawn signs represent the silhouettes, but not the substance of change. Police defunding is a fundamental challenge to state violence, is essential to any meaningful program of transformation. Even more dramatic campaigns have to materialize. So the George Floyd uprisings would not have been as widespread or prolonged had they not arisen against a backdrop of wildcat strikes and grassroots agitation intensified by COVID-19. If these and other tendencies continue to interact, the result could be a more sustained insurrection of the vulnerable, the exploited, and the abandoned. And very briefly, if we talk about a national agenda for substantive racial transformation, ending mass incarceration, abolishing ICE, reparations, ending white supremacist terror in terms of drones and these endless oil wars. Locally, here in Ithaca and Tompkins County, you know, struggling for the fight for $15, hell, the fight for $20 minimum wage, repurposing the Ithaca SWAT truck, defunding the Ithaca Police Department and investing in social programs. And as for Cornell, right, recognize that this rhetoric of any person, any study creates a veneer of virtue. It hides the racist heritage of an institution whose wealth is built on indigenous dispossession and African enslavement. We need to defund diversity and inclusion programming, which is part of the diversity industry, defund and dismantle Cornell Police, struggle for higher wages and better benefits for dining hall workers and custodial staff, push for more hiring of Black and Indigenous and people of color at all levels of employment, end Cornell Tech campus partnership with Technion, an institution that is complicit with Israeli militarism and the perpetuation of the illegal and unjust occupation of Palestine, and Cornell complicity with genocide of ethnic minorities in China, fight gentrification and displacement, greatly increase the subsidy to TCAT, expand the service to West Hill and underdeveloped areas, and substantially subsidize existing grassroots efforts, such as the Black Hands Universal Free Tutoring Program. Thank you. Free Palestine.
Thank you, Russell. Margaret, your brief closing remarks.
How much time do I have? What he said. I agree with much of what Russell's concluding remarks were. However, I think faith has its place. I think white supremacy can be eradicated as long as we don't move into a permanent stage of white nationalism, which in my view where we are headed. And I think that social media is showing that to us. I think that what happened on January 6th, where these protesters, these rioters were in collusion with the then administration, federal administration. I think they knew all about it. I think it was planned. That is the kind of activism that we have to struggle against. But I think that it is possible to eradicate white supremacy because, as we know, America is browning. And there are many whites who don't mind that, just as there are many who want to eradicate non-whites. So I am hopeful. I think our biggest problem is inequality, and it is not color-coded. There are many, many poor whites and people of other races and colors in this country. It is a global problem. The number of billionaires compared to the number of poor people, and we can't even get a $15 an hour minimum wage through. And then the final thing I would say, as far as Cornell is concerned, there is a stained glass window in Sage Chapel in the mausoleum where the Cornells rest. I hope not in peace with that stained glass window of Louis Agassiz there. Agassiz was one of the most prominent scientific racists of the 19th century. And the former Africana director and I held a symposium to try and call attention to this with the Cornell administration. At that time, the president was David Skorton. We were told that we should use it as a teaching moment, which we did. My students wrote papers on Agassiz's racism. We held a symposium. The stained glass window is still there. And it is sacrilegious, not only because it is a chapel, but because in that chapel is a stained glass window of the 3 slain civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And Cornell ought to be ashamed of itself. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Margaret. Christine, last but certainly not least, your quick remarks.
I'm just going to say thank you again to everybody on this call. As I mentioned in an earlier email that I knew I was going to learn a lot tonight, and I learned that and so much more. I would say final remarks, right, for, I guess I would direct this to the students, right? And I guess in many ways, all of us students are hopefully continue to be students in this thing. So I just want to emphasize that as much as I was putting out there, the possibilities of social media and the potential, I also want to really push for a kind of depth of study, right? And the fact that our study, as Ella pointed out, really needs to be omnivorous, really needs to read and imagine and think, right, beyond certain borders. I want to think about something you had brought up earlier, Kat, right, in terms of the ways in which the media, right, can unpack and go deeper with a story about electoral politics, right? We can talk about the complex story that emerges from a tweet, right, from Stacey Abrams, where she shouts out Asian Americans Advancing Justice, right, an organization whose work reaches back to the 2018 efforts, right, in Orange County to really kind of reckon with, right, the changing demographic of that place, to turn, the OC blue, right, which was a big struggle during that time. And even further back, right, to the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, which is the roots of advancing justice, and its role in the 1982 civil rights case for Vincent Chin, which of course, again, was really instrumental in mobilizing, right, a lot of visiting, a lot of people out on the, I think too, in terms of, hearkening back to what Russell was talking about, I think too about a story that came up actually at the January 6th insurrection. And maybe this is what he's talking about in terms of the kind of lower level players, right? And so the kind of ways in which people were surprised, right? That there were various Southeast Asian symbols, right, that emerged, right, during this white nationalist, white supremacist insurrection. But I think for ourselves, right, both educators and as story, right, that it's also kind of having to reckon with the years of U.S. colonization and colonial mentality, right, that has created these kinds of conditions of possibility for brown people, Southeast Asian American people, to imagine themselves somehow as, again, adjacent to a certain whiteness. So I would finally say for students to take courses from every person on this call, which is something I wish I could do for a moment, but that also to know that the study exceeds the classroom, right? And really at the end of the day, I can't imagine the future that these students will show us. And so I, like my colleagues, maybe we don't have all the answers. We can just promise, right, to remain committed to trying to find some solutions.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you all for these powerful remarks, this powerful discussion. I also want to thank our audience for participating and tuning in and having some really excellent questions that really contribute to this dialogue. Cornell will have another webinar in their Racism in America series coming up soon, focused on health inequities. So stay tuned to the Racism in America webpage. That is at as.cornell.edu for more information about the next webinar, as well as the other upcoming webinar on the economy. So thank you all again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Kat.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kat.